Hi, everyone. Gene here. Welcome to the Tapping Q&A podcast, where every single week we answer the most common and uncommon questions about tapping and EFT so you can get the most out of your EFT practice. You can eliminate self-sabotage and start taking the action that you want. Before we jump into today's show, just a reminder, back on Monday, the 2019 Tapping World Summit started. You can still get in. There are still 8 days left that you can take advantage of the free audios every single day. To be able to participate in the Tapping World Summit, all you need to do is go to tappingqna.com/summit. That's tappingqna.com/summit, and you'll get all of the information on how you can sign up. I am presenting on the 8th day of the summit, so you can hear me talk about anger. If you have any questions, you can always drop me a note, Gene, Gene, at tappingqna.com.
We need to acknowledge what's going on. We need to feel it. We need to express it. And then the voices inside, all that worry and that loss of control that we feel, it just starts to quiet down. You know, it sends that message to that amygdala in the brain, right, that says, you know what, well, you're really okay here. You're really safe. There's just a part of you that isn't feeling safe. It's trying to protect you.
This is Gene Monteristilli, and welcome to the Tapping Q&A podcast, recorded live to tape from Williamsburg in Brooklyn. This is episode 352, originally aired February 24th, 2019. Hi, everyone. I hope this finds you well wherever you are, and whatever time of day you're getting a chance to listen to this. Thanks for spending some time with me today. Today, we're going to be talking about worrying anxiety and how you can tap for them. Before we jump into our interview, over the next couple of weeks, like I mentioned last week, we're going to be shouting out every single country that has downloaded an episode of the podcast since the beginning of the year. The 5 countries that I'd like to thank today, and the people in those countries who have taken time to download the podcast, are Nepal, Thailand, South Africa, Greece, and New Zealand. If you are in one of those 5 countries this week, I want you to know how much I appreciate you downloading the podcast. And for all of you that have done it, not living in those countries, I appreciate you as well. Today's conversation is with Julie Schiffman. You might know Julie for years and years and years. She produced the tapping videos for Dr. Marcola and his website. She came to tapping much like I did. She came to tapping through dealing with anxiety and fear. And she was in a circumstance where it just kind of cropped up out of nowhere. So in this conversation, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about her journey, but more specifically, what she learned from that journey and how you can uncover what is behind the fear and anxiety that you're feeling. Because oftentimes in this particular moment, the thing that is causing the worry isn't actually the root cause. And if we can find our way to that root cause, then we're going to be in a situation where we can eliminate the fear moment to moment. And in the middle of this, she talks about a procedure or a process and how you do some tapping on some inner child stuff for those parts of ourselves that have been hanging around since our childhood that are still a little worried and overwhelmed. The process that she shares in the middle of this interview is not something I had ever heard before. Since doing the interview, I have been using it and I love it a lot. So here is my conversation with Julie. What originally got you interested in thinking about and approaching and tapping around anxiety? Why is that something that you find is a natural entry point?
I love that you're asking that question because it's like the heart and soul of who I am. So and that's how I got into tapping to begin with, because I was having panic attacks. I was fresh out of grad school. I was in my early 20s and I was working in a high school. And quote unquote, out of nowhere, I was getting panic attacks and I couldn't even imagine what it was about. And here I'm working with students, with teenagers who are coming to see me for anxiety. And all of a sudden I'm getting a full blown panic attack. Even just walking down a hallway or working with these, teenagers. And it was horrible. I mean, for anybody who has suffered from panic attacks, I mean, they are truly debilitating. And, so I started therapy. That was my first intro to therapy in general, which was just talk therapy. And it was fine. It helped me to sort of see my dad died a few years earlier, and I was trying to sort of deal with that. And then I have a very good friend of mine, Dr. Darren Weissman, who does a lot of energy work, and he developed his own technique or whatnot. And he wasn't doing tapping with me, but he said, you really should be coming to see me about this anxiety because I was telling him about it. And I said, he was a chiropractor. I'm like, well, what are you going to do? You're going to crack my back and I'm going to suddenly start to feel better.
Right.
Yeah. And he said, don't laugh. He said, you just need to come and see me. And I'm like, okay, I don't even know what chiropractic is. I had no idea. I just knew that he went to school for it. So I went to see him and he's doing all this energy work, right? He's muscle testing me and he's touching different parts on my body and, having me think of different thoughts and connecting with the anxiety and some emotions around it and whatnot. And within like a month, 6 weeks, I was like a totally different person. And I couldn't even believe it. And that wasn't with talk therapy. I had already done some of that. And I was like, oh my God, like whatever you just did in this period of time, I need to learn what this energy medicine or energy work is all about because I felt a calling to it. And I wasn't going to go to chiropractic school and I didn't know how one related to another. And at that time, I didn't understand energy work at all. I come from a history of if you're sick or if something's going on, you go to see a doctor. And anyway, he ultimately introduced me to Dr. Mercola. And he said, Dr. Mercola is looking for someone who has a social work background or whatnot, someone who can come in and work with people around anxiety or, what's going on in their body and that sort of thing. And I quit my job. I quit my job at the high school, which was it was a top high school. I was making a lot of money. My husband thought I was crazy. He was like, you cannot leave this good, stable job to go and work for a holistic doctor and not have insurance and all of that. And I'm like, I'm telling you, this is my calling. And so I started working for him and he introduced me to EFT tapping. And he sent me to go and train with, all these great people and meet Gary Craig and whatnot. And so the bottom line is, so I started learning about tapping and I started using it for myself. Okay. And even though when I was working with my friend Darren, he had helped me considerably, I was like, oh my God, like this is it. Like we just need to be able to connect with ourselves in this way. We need to acknowledge what's going on. We need to feel it. We need to express it. And then the voices inside, all that worry and that loss of control that we feel, it just starts to quiet down. It sends that message to that amygdala in the brain, right? That says, you know what, well, you're really okay here. You're really safe. There's just a part of you that isn't feeling safe. It's trying to protect you.
And so inside of that, you talked about the idea that kind of your entry point into all of this was these overwhelming panic attacks.
Yes.
And I'm lucky enough never to have experienced a panic attack, but have been on an airplane with a very dear friend of mine who was having one while we were at 30,000 feet and understand how crippling that particular type of anxiety is. But what is kind of in that spectrum? Like not everybody is experiencing panic attacks, but anxiety is something that is ever present. How does anxiety connect to panic attacks and kind of what is that in your mind? What does that spectrum look like and what's going on? Because at the end of the answer, you're talking about the anxiety that you're experiencing. So how does all of that mesh together?
Correct. So, what it starts with typically is a worry. Right? We start to worry about something. We start getting thoughts in our mind, whether they're rational or irrational. I mean, if you're driving down the street, we just had a big snowstorm over the weekend. So if you're driving down the street and there's a lot of snow and there's a lot of ice, there might be some need to feel anxious, right? You need to be more alert. You need to be, you need to pay attention to what's going on. But if you're at a party or if you're just sitting down for dinner by yourself or you're laying in bed and you start to have all these thoughts come up that are worrying, right? Worry of the what ifs. What if things get out of control? What if? Those are things that we create in our minds, right? Those thoughts that we have are things that are created in our mind. And the emotion that we then start to feel is anxiety because then it starts to show up in our body. We can't separate the thoughts in our mind from the feelings in our body. Because as soon as we have a thought about something, we're going to feel it in our body, right? That mind-body connection. And so in that process, what happens if we're not able to calm those thoughts down, there's a part of us that's trying to protect us with these worries and these fears. And if we're not able to then calm it down in some way, as many people know, not everybody has panic attacks, as you said, but the anxiety can get heightened and more heightened and more heightened. And if we don't listen to that voice inside, if we don't listen to that part of us that is feeling scared or that is feeling out of control or worries about things that, worry about things that can happen, then ultimately what can happen is that it gets so out of control, it leads to panic because we can't get to that place of calm. And so your body just continues to amp it up and amp it up and amp it up because anxiety wants to be seen. It wants to be heard. Otherwise, it's going to speak louder and louder until you finally pay attention.
I've always described worry kind of like the 6-year-old who's in the back seat who's trying to get your attention to let you know that there's a windmill out there, and it's just like mom, 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 and it's going to persist until it is heard. And so it's good that we hear fear. Like, if I'm standing in the middle of the street and a car is bearing down on me and I'm thinking, ooh, I love 67 Mustangs, like that's an unhelpful thing. Like the fact that I'm hearing the fear in that moment is good and real.
For sure.
But I think the thing that you're pointing to that's interesting or that's important for us to recognize is that fear is useful as long as it is proportionate and well-informed. It's unuseful when it is disproportionate, where the fear is much bigger than what the danger is, or it's misinformed where the danger isn't there. So I guess the question comes, how are we able to parse apart the difference? Because our very primitive self hears fear first, always, regardless if it's well-informed or not. And so I become, on some level, at least in the moment, I become a really bad eyewitness and a really bad detective to tell whether or not it's informed or not. So how do we then manage with that sense if that is the case?
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting because when we are young, we are typically, not everybody, we are programmed to sort of brush through emotions, right? Because sometimes we're in a place or we have parents who aren't really sure how or equipped how to deal with our emotions as children. And so, very often they might be ignored or they might be brushed over or don't worry about it. Don't worry about that. Stop worrying, all of those things. And so we're not really taught how to deal with fear. When we're younger, we're not really, unless we had really attentive parents or teachers, we're not really taught or equipped how to do that. So we have to find some way to soothe ourselves, right? And so we shut it off and we ignore it as children. We move on to, oh, look, there's a flower. Or, oh, look, you move on to something else. And then we're adults finally, and we don't really know how to deal with those emotions. And so, as I said before, the key, what I really learned about anxiety for myself is that as soon as I felt anxiety and I was able to look at it and say, okay, I just want you to know, I know you're here. Like I see you. I actually feel you in my body and I feel you in my gut or my chest. And as soon as I acknowledge it and like take a flashlight and just sort of flash it on there, then all of a sudden, it might not go to a zero, but right. This is way back even before tapping and whatnot. But as long as you can identify it, as long as you can listen to it and hear it, then it has this way of sort of diffusing. And so your question is, how do you really do that? So most of your listeners, I'm guessing, probably are familiar with tapping. And so what I say to people, if they're not working with me directly and they're just sort of out there on their own, sort of dealing with things, is to do the same thing you would do before you start tapping, which is, okay, take a second and just sort of take a breath, right? Just get grounded in your body for a minute and pay attention to the anxiety. And so I want you to really look at it and say, okay, where is this in my body? Where am I feeling this in my body? And okay, maybe it's in my gut, or maybe I'm feeling it in my neck or my shoulders or my throat or wherever, my head. For everybody, it's different, but those are very common places. And then you want to look at it and say, okay, 0 to 10, how intense is this anxiety? Maybe it's a 6, maybe it's a 4. It doesn't have to be a 10 to be anxiety. It can just be a feeling that you're having, a sense of nervousness, uneasiness, and out of control feeling. And so you want to connect to that. And then what you can even do, what I like to do, if not everybody is good at this, but if you can get good at it, which is how big is it? How big does it feel? Is it covering your whole chest? Is it the size of a baseball in the middle of your chest? Is it a golf ball? Is it a watermelon? And does it have a color? And so these are different things that we can look at, that we talk about with tapping, right? And that's a way for you to for you to let your body know, to let your mind, to let your subconscious know that you are really in tune to this, like you are really listening to this. And if you have a few minutes, which I recommend, would be to sit down with a piece of paper and really just pay attention for a minute and say, okay, what do you want me to know here? What are you trying to tell me? And some people can come up with it just in a snap and say, okay, well, that this doesn't feel safe. And it might feel rational. It might feel irrational, whatever it is. It doesn't feel safe. Okay, it doesn't feel safe. How does that make me feel? And what a lot of people notice is that, the initial thought might be that, well, it makes me feel scared. But for some people, it doesn't. For some people, it feels like, wow, that makes me feel really sad. I feel really sad inside that I'm feeling that way. And then you want to connect to that sadness. Well, what's that sadness about? Well, I feel sad because I feel alone and I don't have anyone to help me with this. Or, obviously I'm making this up as I go along. I don't have anyone to help me with this. Or I'm feeling abandoned or rejected or whatever it is. Okay, so how does that make me feel? Well, as I said, sadness. So then you want to connect to that. Well, what's that sadness trying to tell you? And so you kind of you can write it down. And so when it starts off with anxiety, you might come to the end of this and be like, it makes me feel sad. It makes me feel angry. It makes me feel vulnerable. And then you come out at the other end of this, like, you know what? I think this can be okay. Because there's this part of us that wasn't able to express ourselves at one point, it is expressing through the anxiety. And so as long as you can follow it through, if you can hear it all the way through, you will see that a shift starts to happen and that you've just worked it through in a matter of minutes. Does that make sense?
Totally, yeah. So as you say all of that stuff, there are three things that struck me. And then the first is what you just got to there at the end, is that I always like to think of fully articulated emotions are short-lived. That an emotion is just trying to communicate information to us. Anxiety is communicating danger. And so it's trying to get our attention. And so when we listen very attentively, then it feels heard because we've been able to have this kind of connection to it. So I think that's a really important thing. The second thing that I think is really key inside of there is you talked about this idea of being able to take a moment and to assess and analyze what you're experiencing. And the neat thing about that is a skill that we can cultivate. That initially that we're in a circumstance where we feel an emotion and we're overcome with the emotion. We feel the emotion, we're overcome with the emotion. But if we take a little time and just practice and just think, when a big emotion comes up, I'm going to take a deep breath and I'm going to ask myself what I'm feeling. And it's the reason why we do fire drills. We do fire drills so that when the building is literally on fire, I was in a grade school that caught on fire, and it was a small fire in the kitchen. It was no big deal. No damage happened to that. But 450 kids got out of the building without incident because we knew exactly what to do when that alarm went off.
Exactly.
Like, even though we could smell smoke in that instant, even though there were sirens at that particular time, we all knew exactly what to do and we did that thing. And being able to respond to the emotions that we're experiencing in this particular way becomes this really useful thing. The third thing that you touched on that I think is missed a lot when we're tapping on things is we have our experience and then we have the emotion about the experience. Correct. And those are separate things. And so particularly for someone who has been in a circumstance where maybe they've had lifelong anxiety and they've never been able to get a handle on it, or they have spoken it out loud and people are like, oh, it's no big deal, you shouldn't be scared. And they become embarrassed by their anxiety, that there are these other emotions that come along with it. And the little process that you talk about there where we're investigating and we're having a little conversation with the anxiety to see what's really going on by taking that brief little second. And part of it is, and I like the way that you said, kind of ask it what it's about, is when we disassociate, we're no longer intellectually trying to figure it out. Like, we're just asking, and it's so funny. Like, I oftentimes put a little cartoony face on my emotion when I'm talking to it, just so that I can get my brain away from it. Like, okay, dude, tell me what's going on here. What are you really worried about?
Yeah.
And it seems silly, but it's amazing how quickly information starts coming forward. And if you're not trying to analyze it, and like you said, you're just writing it down, you'll be shocked and amazed that even in 4 or 5 sentences, the amount of clarity you're going to get about that thing. And all of a sudden, you have a mini tapping script and you have a bunch of issues that you can now investigate separately that the anxiety might be a consequence of, but aren't directly causing the anxiety. And so when we take care of the core issue, the symptom that is the anxiety also goes away.
Exactly. Couldn't have said it better myself. Shocked and amazed. That is truly, I can't tell you how many times I tend to be wired toward anxiety. So, that's usually my go-to is that suddenly, thankfully I've got tools now that I don't have to go to that place where it gets so out of control. But there are some times that my youngest daughter just got her driver's license. And, if that doesn't create anxiety, I don't know what does. And so, as a mother, as a parent, your mind can really go to these places. As I said, we just had a snowstorm over the weekend. She literally has had her driver's license for 1 week. And,
right.
And so, she wanted to drive. She wanted to drive to a friend's house in the snowstorm. And I can't tell you where my mind went. Well, I don't think you should go. It's a snowstorm. You haven't driven in it. And I started getting in this place and I was like, okay, wait a minute. This isn't really realistic. She's got to get out there. She's got to learn how to drive in the snow. But I could let myself get to this place, which just goes so far off. And I really did. I sat down before I let her go. But I sat down and I really did do some tapping around it because it was my issue. It wasn't her issue. She did just fine. I let her go. But it was my issue. And then, and I did a little bit of that. I did a little bit of writing about that. It started with anxiety or out of control feelings, the what ifs. What if she gets in an accident? What if someone else crashes into her? And, I went through this whole crazy scenario in my head, all the what ifs. But I happen to love what if tapping. And so then I come up with a new, I create a new reframe around it, which is, well, what if she gets there just fine? And what if this is easy? And what if it helps her to learn? And, we're all just fine. And so, but sitting down and going through that for 5 minutes and coming back to, what, this is my issue, not hers. This is going to be fine. And if it's not fine, we'll deal with it in the moment. We'll deal with it when it happens. And so when you say, you'd be shocked and amazed when you realize, and what it actually came back to is that I got in a car accident the day after I got my driver's license. And so it really was even more about that. So tapping on that. And then I was like, oh, whatever, all good.
And I think the other thing that's important to recognize as we talk about this, you got calm, you let your daughter go out the door, it was no big deal, that we're also not putting ourselves in a position where we think, well, I'm just going to tap all of the fear away. Because I think one of the things that we do when we tap in this capacity is we move our way back towards a sense of proportionate, well-informed. I can tap for my fear of tigers, but never get to a place where I'm going to climb into the tiger pen and pet the tigers. Like, I still have a proportionate sense of this. And it is possible in that particular circumstance where the snowstorm could have been such that even after tapping for 5 minutes, you're able to go, no, as a person who has lived in Illinois through these winter snowstorms for decades and decades, like, it's not, I'm worried about my young daughter going out and driving. This is unsafe. And I've done some tapping, but I can still see that clearly, that even though I've tapped on this, I'm not just going to let you be careless and reckless, because I think that that's something that can hold us back in releasing any sort of fear is we think that we're going to swing in the opposite direction. Sure. Like, our fears keep us safe. And there's a part of us that's afraid that I'm just going to become reckless and stupid and dumb. And oftentimes when I'm even tapping on fears, I'll even add a phrase like that into it. Yeah. Even though I'm giving myself permission to be more comfortable with this, I'm also not giving myself permission to be reckless and dumb. I'm still going to be thoughtful. I'm still going to be deliberate. So even as I'm working with the fear, I'm still speaking from a rational, logical place. So it's easier for that fear to go, okay, we can handle all of this because he's not going to go be dumber than he normally is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
So I guess as a side question to all of this, like we've talked about, like the moment you just shared, where something comes up, we have a sensitizing event, we have a thought, we have a new experience, anxiety shows up. What about that sense where there's just kind of like this low-level anxiety that is in the background that at a certain point we just start tuning out, the way that I'm able to tune out the people who are seated 2 tables away from me who are talking too loudly in a coffee shop. Like I'm able to just kind of go and turn that off. So the noise is still there. And I know that with anxiety, it is possible for us to be in a place where we just kind of like ignore it, but we're having to deal with the consequences of the biochemistry of dealing with that particular thing and what's happening inside of our body. Do you have any thoughts on how we approach this kind of low-level anxiety and what's kind of the entry point on something like that?
Yeah. So I would say with low-level anxiety, you still need to acknowledge it. Obviously, if you're in the midst of something, you're in a meeting and you feel it, you can't start tapping on yourself right then and there. But one of the things that I learned early on, and that I've actually helped, teach my clients also, is that if you can identify, and again, you might need a few minutes to actually think about it, but if you can identify how old you're feeling in the moment, not everybody can do that, but if you can identify it, or just pick a childlike part of you, maybe it's 4, maybe it's 6 years old, whatever it is, a child, as you felt scared at some point, and just keep them with you. Just like sort of like look at this child. And again, you don't have to necessarily start talking verbally out loud to them. It could be something that you can have them next to you. You can have them in your pocket. You can have them, tucked in your purse. You can have, wherever. And to just say, you know what, I want you to know you're okay right now. You're okay. And you're safe and you're here with me. And I'm the adult now. And I'm not going to take advice from a 4-year-old or a 6-year-old who, is probably the one who is leading that low level anxiety. There's probably an element there of like something here doesn't feel safe. It feels uncomfortable. It doesn't feel right, whatever it is, but that's not probably you in the present moment. It's probably a very younger part of you that is showing up and trying to protect you. And so that's one thing you can do, if you are able to do it in the moment, is just sort of acknowledge that younger part of you and just say, you know what, well, I'll come back to this later, but you're safe with me right now. I'm actually safe. My feet are on the ground. You can do that. You can actually put your feet on the ground. You can feel your back in your chair, just sort of sitting in it. You can feel yourself connected in the moment. Take a couple breaths. So those are things that can help in the moment. The other things, if you are able to do a little bit of tapping, then I always suggest, take a minute, go to the bathroom, tap on the side of your fingertips. I think this is a great way, when people are in a situation where there's other people around and, there's different places. You could tap on the, on the top of your kneecap or above the kneecap. There are different places where you can tap where people don't know that you're actually doing that. But I think it's always coming back to, why am I feeling this way? What's going on right now that causes me to feel like I am not in a safe place? Even if it's a 2 or a 3, again, it doesn't have to be an 8 or a 10. Right. But coming back to, okay, and then you sort of think about it. Okay, well, what's happening right now that's making me feel this way? Is it someone talking to me and it's what they're saying? Am I feeling pulled into a conversation that I don't want to be a part of? Is it that I'm going to be expected to come up with answers or solve somebody else's problem? Is it something around I have a stomach ache and I'm worried about where that's going? Is it a health related issue? Is it about that bill that I received in the mail yesterday that I'm worried about paying? There could be a whole lot of different things, right? Life goes by so quickly and there's so many different things that it can be. But we're not really going to figure it out unless we stop and take a second and take a breath and say, okay, what's going on here? Because sometimes when we can give it a voice, as we were talking about before, if you can give it a voice, if you can identify it and recognize what it's about, it can diffuse so quickly.
And in the beginning of that, you're talking about that younger part of you. And what you do, I do a lot as well, where we're letting the part know that you don't have to be in charge anymore. And one of the things that I found, and you're not going to probably notice this in the moment, but after the fact, when you've noticed this younger part that's showing up in fear, or you're working with a practitioner and you're dealing with something like that, oftentimes the reason why that really young part shows up and tries to take over is because at that point in your life, that part decided that it was in charge of something that it wasn't actually in charge of and was deciding to be the adult in that particular moment, either because there were adults around it that weren't capable of taking care of it, or it was completely isolated. So it had to be the adult in the circumstance. And I just love the idea of, I'm the adult, I'm the one in charge, you get to be a kid now. And just oftentimes, if we're able to connect with that younger part in that particular way, it's just kind of like, great, I'm taking this mantle off that I no longer need to do. But it gives us, maybe not in the moment as we're managing the anxiety, but in a long-term way, an entry point that gives us a chance to go in and keep going after the things that are showing up, creating that anxiety.
Totally. And the other thing that you just reminded me, something that I often do either with myself or with clients also, and you talked about that 6-year-old in the car that's like, mom.
Yeah.
What I often do with clients is I'll say, because sometimes people really feel like they need to carry that anxiety with them. That's it's like self-soothing in some strange way, right? It's comfortably uncomfortable. And so oftentimes I'll have people imagine, and I'll have them imagine in a car. And, I'll have them actually talk to the anxiety and say, okay, you know what, you can come along for this ride, but you need to sit in the back seat. And I'll have them pick a different emotion where they can sit in the front seat. And awesome. So let's say people pick like courage, let's just say. Okay, that's something that I'll use. If I'm like, okay, anxiety, you can sit in the back seat. You're not allowed to touch the steering wheel. You can look out the window, and if there's something really dangerous coming up, you can speak up. But you need to be back here, and I'm going to sit in the front seat with courage or with bravery or strength or whatever it is. And but you have to be back there. And it works so well for people because they're able to say, okay, I don't have to get rid of it entirely because that does not feel totally safe to some people, which is okay. So bring it along, but it doesn't have to run the show, and it doesn't have to drive to the destination. And that you between you and courage and bravery and safety and whatever else, you can do the driving, and you can get there, and you can be safe, and anxiety will be back there. And if it needs to speak up, it will.
And I love the way you put that, because what it does is it doesn't diminish the value that having worrying and anxiety exists. Like, it is literally something that keeps us alive in circumstances, but we're able to put it in a position that makes the most sense. So it's not taking over and doing anything super crazy.
Totally.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, Julie, thank you very much for your time. That was awesome.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Lots of really, really great stuff in there. If you'd like more information from Julie, she's actually in the process of creating some more comprehensive resources around tapping for anxiety and worry. All you need to do is go to tappingpodcast.com, click on the link for episode 352. If you are already in the website, if you look down below the player, you will see a link to all of her amazing contact information. As well, you can find a link to the previous interview that Julie and I did on the podcast a couple of years ago. If you know someone in your life who could really benefit from a conversation like this, someone who has that fear, that anxiety that's gnawing in the back of their head, or something that's deeper, that just really impacts their life day to day. That's exactly where I was in my early 30s, that my social anxiety had gotten to the point that it wasn't just getting in the way of my life, it was actually crippling my ability to move forward. And tapping is a wonderful, wonderful tool to help you to transform that. So if you know someone who could use this interview, please be our ambassador, pass it along. The easiest way for people to find a new podcast or a new piece of audio is based on a recommendation of a friend. And if you could do that, that would mean the world to me. If you have questions, if you have comments, if you have a topic you'd like us to cover in the future, please let me know. I can always be reached directly at Gene, Gene, at tappingqna.com. If you're on the website, just click on that contact link. I will get your email. Or if you happen to be one of those people who have already downloaded the free Tapping Q&A app, just click in the contact area of the Tapping Q&A app, and you will get access to being able to send me a voice message or an email right from inside of the app. If you haven't downloaded the app already, you should do that. Simply go to the Apple App Store or the Google Play App Store. You will find the app by simply searching for Tapping Q&A. In addition to having access to every single piece of audio that we have created, there's also a number of tapping scripts that are waiting right inside of the app that you at your fingertips will have wherever you go. For the Tapping Q&A podcast, this is Gene Montrestelli. I hope you have a great day, and I will talk to you real soon. Bye-bye. The Tapping Q&A podcast is copyright Gene Montrestelli, Tapping Q&A 2016. All views expressed by guests are those of the guests and not necessarily of Gene Montrestelli or Tapping Q&A.